Okay, so here we are, beginning of the book of Esther. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush, which is Ethiopia, the Upper Nile region. There's a footnote down here by the name Xerxes saying, in Hebrew, this name is Ahasuerus. No, leave me alone, please. Thank you. Just constantly bothered by cats. So in the Hebrew version, it's Ahasuerus, a variant of Xerxes. Xerxes is his Greek name. Ahasuerus is his Persian name. And his Persian name is so difficult to pronounce, I'm not even going to try. You can look it up if you want to. I don't know how you get Xerxes from Sharon or whatever his name is. I mean, I'm not a linguistic expert. Okay, just somehow from his Persian name, you get Xerxes in the Greek. This is the fourth guy referred to in Daniel 11 as the four kings of Persia. So in Daniel chapter 10, he gets a vision. Then he sees this man, this being, I believe is the pre-incarnate Jesus, who comes to explain it to him. And this being starts his explanation at the end of chapter 10, beginning chapter 11. And chapter 11, Daniel 11, verse 10, chapter 11, verse 2, it says, now that I tell you the truth, 3 more kings will appear in Persia after the one that's currently there, and then a fourth who will be far richer than all the others. And this is the fourth king that we're referring to here. We've had Cyrus, we've had, if you count Darius, the Mede, the original guy that was there when Daniel was, let's see here, in Daniel 10, when he got his vision, it was the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. So this is either Cyrus himself is the first guy, or his son Cambyses, and then Darius, the second Darius the Persian, not Darius the Mede, and then Xerxes, and then there was an imposter. Actually, there was an imposter king in between there, and then now this is Xerxes. This is the guy that was talked about in Daniel 11 as having much greater wealth than all the others. He will be, the fourth will be far richer than all the others. When he has gained power by his wealth, he will stir up everyone against the kingdom of Greece. And that's what happens. Actually, this guy's father, Darius, began that fight against Greece, but this guy, Xerxes, is going to continue, and he's going to lose. So he's going to have to go back and nurse his wounds after losing, not being able to conquer Greece. That's actually what's going on here at the beginning of Esther. The book of Esther doesn't actually explain that, but what's really happening here at the beginning of Esther is Xerxes is building support for his planned upcoming attack against Greece. So this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. Some Bibles, by the way, some strict Bibles, not this version, but some will actually have the name Ahasuerus there. I prefer the name Xerxes myself. That's a lot easier for me to say, so I'm going to say Xerxes. That's what it reads here on this page, and that's what I'm going to say. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. Now Daniel had a vision in Susa. This is a city east of Babylon. Going back to Daniel, one of his visions occurred while he was by the canal in Susa. Daniel 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision after the one that had already appeared to me. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, in the province of Elam. I was beside the Ulai Canal. So this is the same place. No, we're not in a vision here. This is actually happening here in the citadel of Susa, which is one of the capitals of the Persian Empire. And the 3rd year of his reign, he reigned from 486 to 465 BC. This is around the year 483 or so. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, Now it's Persia and Media now. Once upon a time it was Media and Persia. Now it's Persia and Media. The balance of power has switched. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, and the nobles of the provinces were present. For a full 180 days, that's 6 months, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and the glory of his majesty. And this doesn't mean they were having a drunken feast for 180 days. It means for 180 days he had basically an exposition going on. And this was largely for the military leaders. Probably, the text doesn't actually say this, but probably for the sake of building support for his intended campaign against Greece. That's probably what's going on. The text doesn't say that. It doesn't actually make that clear, but that's undoubtedly what's going on behind the scenes here. When these days were over, so when his 6-month exposition was over, the king gave a banquet, lasting 7 days, in the enclosed garden of the king's palace, for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. The citadel of Susa is different from the rest of the town. The citadel is basically where the king and the important people lived. We saw this in Jerusalem, too, back in its day. We had this part of Jerusalem called the City of David, which isn't really the entire city. It's not really all of Jerusalem. It's just the part where the king lives and the VIPs, the important people. We see this in our capital cities even today. You have the part of the city that's where the capital is, or where the governor or the president lives, and then you have the part where the people live. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars, so bright and colorful, and extravagant and lavish. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the others, all handcrafted to be different from the rest. And royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. The Persian kings were pretty liberal in their day. In this case, talking about like liberal in a sense of excess. But we're going to find, as we see here and as we've seen already, the Persian kings are pretty accommodating for the peoples of their empire, far more than the Greeks later on would be. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink, and is actually part of the reason why the Greeks were not so liberal as the Persians, is because the Greeks thought that the Persians were barbarians for being so liberal. That's part of the reason why the Greeks turned out the way they did. Now, the Greeks, they ended up conquering Persia in the 330s BC, but before that, they were always being attacked by Persia. Now, Persia never really got the better of Greece. They won some of the battles and occasionally took some of the territory, but Persia never really controlled Greece, but they did fight against them for like 200 years. So the Greeks developed kind of a distaste for the Persians and the Persian ways. And one of the things they didn't like about Persia was their tolerance for other cultures. That's part of the reason why the Greeks turned out the way they did. And of course, the Greeks led to the Enlightenment. It's like that's where the spirit of the Enlightenment comes from. So these trends are not new. Okay, like these rich, white, upper class academic liberals that sit in their ivory towers and think about how great they are and how smart they are compared to everybody else. That comes directly from the Greeks of the 400s and 300s BC. Okay, like that is not new. That is not a new trend. Anyway, wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the others, and the royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way. And the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So what that means, normally you had to drink the same amount the king drank. Okay, if the king raised his glass to his lips and drank, you had to raise your lips to your glass and drink. Okay, that was the normal protocol. Everybody drank the same amount as the king. In this case, he's waived that rule and has allowed everyone to drink as much as they want, more than the king or less than the king. So everyone's getting drunk. It's a drunken orgy. For 7 days. For 7 days, these guys are partying and drinking and having a merry old time. Meanwhile, somewhere else in the palace, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. I'm sure these women were not excited about the idea of hanging out with these drunken men for 7 days. So they had their own thing going on somewhere else. On the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown. Some say wearing only her royal crown, but the text itself doesn't say that, in order to display her beauty to the peoples and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. This is a very temperamental, emotional king. This guy, okay, so Xerxes, there will be some part, he will be portrayed somewhat positively later on in his tenderness towards Esther, as later on. But this dude Xerxes was not a good king. Okay, this is a guy very similar actually to Belshazzar, the king who was in charge of Babylon at the time of its fall to the Medo-Persian Empire, in that he inherited a kingdom. He did not build this kingdom. He inherited it. All he's ever known is wealth and excess and lavishness and extravagance. He does not understand the cost of building or maintaining a kingdom, as you can see here by all the stuff he's doing here. And he will actually, even though the Persian kingdom will exist for about another 130 years after him, he will kind of bring about the beginning of the end for the Persian kingdom because of his excess and his wantonness. He is not a good guy. He is not portrayed positively in ancient documents or sources. And because he basically bankrupts the kingdom with all of his excesses and spends all of his energy trying and failing to conquer Greece, he essentially, it takes 130 years after him, but he essentially sets the Persian Empire on a one-road way to ruin. So he's not a good guy. We don't look back on this dude fondly. And one thing we see here in the book of Esther is how impetuous and temperamental he is. He can't make his own decisions. He always needs someone else to tell him what to do. And he overreacts emotionally to everything that happens around him. He's just one of those guys. He's like Donald Trump, actually. He's one of those kinds of guys. He inherited wealth. He never built his own empire. He thinks he's the best. He wildly overreacts to everything that goes on around him. And the only thing that matters to him is people's personal loyalty and fealty to he himself. Nothing else matters other than that. Very, very, very similar. Very similar personality type. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, again, he can't make his own decisions, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshana, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Maris, Marsina, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. Persia was split up. It was governed by 7 aristocratic families. I don't know if this is a reference to each of these guys coming from one of those families. I don't know. It doesn't say that. But Persia's government was consisted of 7 aristocratic families. And so he gets advice from 7. By the way, this repeated reference to 7 is one of those behind-the-scenes clues showing us that God is really in control of all of this. Because 7 is the perfect number. 7 is a holy number. So the constant reference to the number 7 is one of those clues that the book of Esther includes to identify God as the behind-the-scenes agent working throughout the story, even though the name of God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? The king asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. The text does not explain why she didn't obey him. I think it's actually pretty self-evident. This queen did not want to put herself out there in front of a whole bunch of drunken dudes. There are some traditions that when it says she's supposed to be wearing her royal crown, that was a reference to her wearing only her royal crown. That the text doesn't actually say that, so that's an assumption. possible, but the text doesn't say that, so we shouldn't take that to mean that seriously. But I think it's pretty self-evident. Like, what woman would want to be out there in the midst of this? I said, yeah, they've been keeping themselves separate the whole time anyway. Like, what woman would actually want? We know from later on that it wasn't forbidden for women and men to have banquets together, because Esther does have a banquet with the king and some other dude later on. So Esther had banquets with the king. So it's not like it was forbidden for the women to be out there at the same time as the men. They just didn't want to be, I think. I don't know why they would want to be. I don't know why they would want to be a part of that. I don't know why Vashti would want to be a part of that. I don't know why. And, in all honesty, Vashti probably couldn't come. Their culture of propriety and modesty probably forbade her from coming anyway. The king is drunk, so he is not in his... Vashti is probably correct not to come, because their culture of modesty and propriety probably would have forbidden it under normal circumstances. But the king is drunk out of his mind, having been drinking for 7 straight days, and he has no idea what he's doing or saying. So he's forgetting the normal way of doing things, the normal customs of modesty and protocol. So Vashti is probably correct not to come. But Xerxes is drunk out of his mind, and he's not thinking in those terms. So what must be done to her? She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan, he was the last guy mentioned in that group of 7 earlier, replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. Now this has become a national crisis. This has gone from being just a simple dispute between a husband and a wife to being a national crisis and a source of major national emergency. But the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands, and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Our women will go out of control. Man, I'm telling you, when our women get out of control, our society falls. We can't let that happen. We got to get these women back into control. There is just no end. There is just no end to the discord and disharmony and disrespect that will commence if we allow the women to think they can tell their husbands no. We can't let that happen. Absolutely not. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. We saw that in Daniel, too, when he was dealing with Daniel and Darius and the guys of that era in time. For some reason, the mindset prevailed in this culture that the law was ironclad. I think the idea was that the king was not supposed to be wrong, so whatever he decreed, whatever he issued, could not be taken back, even by himself, because he was supposed to be right in the first place. It was supposed to be a good, right, and righteous law in the first place. So let it be written in the laws of Media and Persia, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her a royal position. No, he doesn't say assassinate her. Doesn't say to execute her. Doesn't even say to divorce her. It just says she's never going to come in his presence again. Also let the king give her a royal position to someone, by the way, she's no longer Queen Vashti, she's just Vashti now, to someone else who is better than she, someone who will actually do what the king tells her to do. That's what makes a woman good, is if she does what her husband tells her to do. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. That's the way it should be. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his own household. What the man says goes, even down to the language he speaks. If the man and the woman come from different backgrounds and have different native tongues, it's the man's native tongue that prevails in that household. There. That'll teach all these uppity, disrespectful women a thing or two. Vashti is not executed here. Vashti is not even divorced. She is just not allowed to come into the king's presence again. So she is still around somewhere. She's just not going to be a factor in this story any longer. She will actually probably ultimately outlast Esther. In the records that we have of the Persian kings, Xerxes' wife is named something like Amestris, and that is probably Vashti. It could be another. It's probably not Esther. From what we know of Esther, her conduct and behavior doesn't seem to match with Amestris' conduct at all. It's probably not her. And as we find out, Xerxes had no shortage of women he could have chosen. So it could be someone else completely different that is not mentioned here in Esther at all. Could be. And neither of these women in Esther is mentioned in any other accounts. It could be. I mean, the king had no shortage of women at his disposal. But it could also be Vashti. I don't know how you get the name Vashti out of Amestris. And again, Vashti may not even be a name. But it could be very well that Vashti is Amestris. And Amestris will actually bear the son who will become the next king. One of the reasons why if this is Amestris, one of the reasons why she is not executed here probably is because she's pregnant with the king's child, who will end up actually becoming the next king as we speak. She's probably pregnant with that son as of right now. So it's probably her. Vashti and Amestris are probably the same person. And this lady will actually give birth to the next king, and she will reemerge in the reign of the next king as the queen mother. The most powerful position a woman could have in this day and time was not to be the wife of the king. It was to be the mother of the king. Okay, the king could have many wives. Xerxes has multiple wives. Okay, being the wife of the king was a good gig, but it was not the way to true power if you were a woman in the kingdom. The way to true power as a woman in this kingdom was to give birth to the king. Because he can only have one mother. He can have many wives. He can only have one mother. So the most powerful female in these kingdoms at this point in time was always going to be the lady who gave birth to the king. Esther does not give birth to the next king. Some lady named Amestris does. So Esther does not end up becoming like the favored wife of Xerxes throughout his time. Because the child, she does not, I'm assuming she bears a child for him, although we don't read about it in Esther. But if she does, maybe she doesn't. But if she does, whatever child she bears to the king does not end up becoming the next king. And that will be the privilege that Amestris has. And so she, whoever Amestris is, outlast Esther in the grand scheme of things, because it will be she who gives birth to the guy who will be the next king. So anyway, so that's what's going on here. This is happening in the third year of Xerxes' reign, which is in the year 483 or so BC, and he is giving this banquet and this festival, this 180-day exhibition of his display of his splendor and wealth, in order to build support for his planned attack against Greece. That's what this is for. He's going to go do that. And it's going to happen in between the last verse of Esther 1 and the first verse of Esther. The writer of Esther is not going to mention it at all. But that is actually what's going on in between Esther 1 and Esther 2. There's a gap in time here of a few years, because during that time, Xerxes is going to be fighting out in the Mediterranean Sea and the region around there, fighting Greece, and he's going to come back. He's going to come back having been defeated. He is not going to end up prevailing against Greece. He will have some victories, and he will ultimately be repelled, and he'll have to come back to Persia, licking his wounds. And that's when he takes comfort in his harem. That's what's going to be happening here at the beginning of chapter 2.